All right, David, we're back, but this time you're asking me questions.
That's right. That's right. He
Let's
said
go.
he's never not got his thinking cap on. I doubt that these questions are anywhere near as complex enough to confuse you. But I'm really interested to hear what you have to say on these different aspects of training.
Yeah. It's always a great opportunity, I think, for me to exchange with people like you in the sport because I don't have the experience and the knowledge that comes with the high level competing. I've always been very interested in the sport. I think I did CrossFit in I forget the year, but it must have been 2011 or 2012. I did a few classes and then I bought a barbell and then I did kind of a garage thing. I was in Vancouver at the time. Trained with Emily. No, I didn't train. She coached me. Emily Beers. She had gone to the games a couple times back
Oh
then, if I
yeah,
remember correctly, across of Vancouver. And then I found weightlifting and then I got into that and then I found rowing and then I got into that. But I never competed in CrossFit, but I've always kind of had a one foot in and always paid attention to what was going on. And so it's fascinating to be able to talk with guys like you. And so we did the podcast and I was able to ask you questions, but I find it almost as interesting having questions coming back from the CrossFit side because that helps me also better understand the space and how it operates and also how to operate within it. So I appreciate you, just being open to even asking questions. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you for making the time to answer them because for me, selfishly, this is a great way for me to form a better understanding of how to train and compete more effectively. Um, for the athletes that I work with, it gives me more tools that I can use to help them be better athletes. And for anyone listening, it's also an opportunity for them to potentially optimize other aspects of their life as well to be better athletes and better CrossFitters.
Hopefully. Yeah.
So my first question is heat and regards to
Mm.
heat with performance. So it's something that I've looked into a little bit, but mostly in terms of the effect of heat on performance. We've recently had, for anyone who listens to, I think Andrew Huberman is probably the one that's put out a fair amount on this and the
Mm.
effects of cold exposure, but also the effects of heat on performance and how
Mm.
the increases in body temperature can decrease performance.
Mm.
So my question to you is, what is your opinion on the effects of heat on performance, both in terms generally, but perhaps in specifically to CrossFit? Is it something that's important enough that we should be paying attention to it?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I am not extremely well educated on heat, but I have a few ideas, so I'll do my best. One thing to consider is that when the external environment is hot, and especially if it's hotter than what you're used to, you're going to have to contribute a proportion of your blood flow to offsetting that heat internally. So essentially, you have to bring more blood to your skin to get that heat outside of your body to be able to radiate it out of your organism. So that has a cost because internally now you don't have as much blood to just get oxygen to the muscles and do the work to keep things simple. So that's a cost, and you can drive that cost down with heat adaptation. So if you're adapted to heat and you're used to tolerating an external environment that is hotter than normal, it will cost you less, so to speak, internally. So that's, I think, one thing to consider that's interesting. And it's obviously an effect. It's obviously going to have an effect on performance if you're traveling to a location that you're not used to and that is significantly hotter than where you usually train. So heat climatization is something that I've looked into a little bit. I know that in cycling, they consider 2 weeks to be the optimal time to get used to a certain environment and temperature. And from memory, I'm trying to remember, and I'll have to send you some information on that in case I get it wrong. But there was an idea of doing the high intensity in the morning when it was cooler, and then getting some heat exposure on the longer rides in the afternoon for the cyclists, something like this, to get used to the temperature, but still get the quality of training with the high intensity, not necessarily inside the heat. I know that triathletes also use it simply because they're going to be running hot for 7, 8, 9 hours in the Ironman division. And that, again, if you can get more comfortable with the discomfort of being hot for long periods of time, is going to help. I had Jameson Plus on the podcast a while back. He's a Canadian under 24 world champion last year, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And he swears by the sauna twice a week. He says after post training, he goes in for 20 minutes to half an hour, and he does that twice a week. And he says, if I don't do it, I really, really feel it on competition day, and it really hampers my performance. So that's on the performance side. And then there's also the heat adaptation side of things. It seems like, I think from what I've seen, there's some very encouraging data on heat exposure and heat training having a similar effect to altitude training when it comes to, I think it's plasma volume and ultimately oxygen transport capability. So altitude training helps us carry more oxygen in our blood by raising the hemoglobin mass, given that the more hemoglobin you have, the more oxygen you can transport to your muscles. So oxygen delivery is improved by altitude training. And also, if you have more, plasma volume, it means you have essentially more liquid in your pipes, more in your system, and that helps with preload of the heart and ejection as well. So essentially, if you have more blood, you're going to pump better, because the heart is it's like a spring. Think of the bottom of the squat. So if you pause at the bottom of the squat, you're not as efficient coming back up. Well, the heart is like you not pausing at the bottom of the squat, because it fills, and then when it's full, it contracts. And the fuller it is, the harder it contracts. It kind of responds that way. So if you have more blood in your system through either altitude training or heat training, apparently, you're going to have a better effect on that side of things. So I haven't looked into that in detail, but yeah, from what I've seen, it seems like heat training might be a really interesting way to get those adaptations, because we all know that altitude training is great on paper, but you have to go for 2 to 4 weeks in a location that is not your home, and you have to train there. And obviously at the beginning, the performances are going to be hampered because you just don't have as much oxygen to do the work. I'm not fully acquainted with how valuable altitude training is for sports such as CrossFit, simply because of the strength aspect of the sport, and how, from what I understand, everything that's more on the neurological or nervous side of things is going to also be impacted. And what's the trade? It's always a trade-off, obviously, when you go in in that kind of environment. And I'm not sure what the trade-off, if the trade-off is net positive for a CrossFit athlete versus for a long distance Ironman athlete. So yeah, I would say if you're not used to heat and you go compete in the heat, you're going to be at a disadvantage. You can definitely train that. And again, there might even be some improved oxygen transport there, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
That was a load of really useful information there. Thank you. I've got some tips from what you've just said there to take forward to competition next time that we're competing in a hot environment, things that we can do to better prepare for that. And that's really interesting about what you said, that what might be the case for training within heat or heat exposure being similar to some of the effects potentially from altitude training as well. So in effect, it could be something that's beneficial for us to do within
I do
our
think
training.
so. I do think
even
so.
if we're not competing in a hot environment. Okay.
Yeah.
So the rest of my questions are more to do with something that I know is very much within your expertise, which is zone 2 training. The first one being, what is the importance of doing the same, we'll say, machine or the same movement for your zone 2 work versus switching between movements within a session? So for example, if I am doing a session that is 60 minutes on the C2 bike versus 10 minutes on the C2 bike, 10 minutes running, or 10 minutes on the C2 bike and 10 minutes Stairmaster, alternating between the two, is there a difference in the value of those sessions or the adaptation that I'm getting?
I'd probably say yes, but I think they can both be used depending on who the person is and what you're trying to achieve. I think for someone who's never done any low intensity and you're trying to introduce the concept and they just need to get some minutes going easy, doing a circuit is totally fine. I think I don't see an issue with that. I would have answered differently a year ago. But I think buy-in is such an important part of this aspect of the sport that we have to consider it in how we plan. So I'd say, yeah, for someone who doesn't have any exposure to it, circuit is totally fine. The way I understand some of the adaptations that happen from the longer efforts, an hour and then plus, I think continuous blood flow and uninterrupted blood flow has a considerable impact on development like capillary density. So essentially, the micro vessels that are around our muscle fibers, which are the exchange interface between the blood and the muscle. And the analogy I like to use is a cab analogy. So imagine you get to the airport in a cab, and there's 4 parking spots. So every cab can have 4 passengers. So in a minute, you can offload, say, 16 people if there's 4 cabs and they're all parked at the same time. Now, if you have 10 parking spots, now all of a sudden you can offload 40 people at a time. And capillaries work the same. The more capillaries you have, the more oxygen you can offload from your hemoglobin, from your red blood cells into the muscle. And ultimately, if you have the infrastructure, which you're going to build with the capillaries, I mean, if you develop your capillaries, you're going to build more mitochondria and those kind of infrastructure internal to the muscle fiber. And ultimately, the more blood you can bring to the muscle, the higher rate of work you can sustain in a stable, in a steady state, so to speak. And so the higher output you can maintain for longer periods of time. If you're familiar with the concept of critical power, you might have used it in rowing, or simply threshold as the concept of going from an elevated yet stable internal state to above threshold, which you lose your internal balance and you can't maintain that for very long. There's definitely a finite amount of time that you can push that through. And it turns out critical power, which is one way of determining threshold, is highly correlated to the number of capillary contacts around type 1 fibers, meaning that the person that can bring the most oxygen to their type 1 fibers has a higher critical power. And to simplify things massively, my perspective on CrossFit is that equal strength, skill, and everything else, the person that can maintain the highest rate of work for the longest amount of time is going to win. And
makes sense.
Yeah. So it's all about, okay, how high can I have my threshold be so that I can maintain that high rate of work without going into the red? Or if I'm into the red, it costs me less because I'm starting from a higher point than the other person. So for me, and I went a bit on a tangent there, the development of capillaries, and from the ability to vasodilate, to kind of open the valves and the pipes and let the oxygen or the blood go through with the oxygen, is directly linked to how much time you spend doing a certain activity. If you drop a hose in your garden with water running through it and you have a slope, it's going to form those kind of rivers, right? It's going to dig those grooves. And if you leave it for enough time, it's going to form its own little network of streams and whatnot down the grass. I kind of visualize it this, and I don't actually know if it happens like that, but it works in my brain. I think about it the same way when it comes to developing those capillaries. You need that constant blood flow going through, uninterrupted by strong, hard muscle contractions, for those capillaries to develop and to multiply. And in that context, it makes sense that you want to keep the same stimulus applied for longer periods of time. Another parameter that's important to understand is the interplay between metabolic vasodilation, essentially your body responding to the need for more oxygen from the muscle, right? You start working, you use oxygen, you need more oxygen. It almost calls from the muscle upwards, where your arteries are going to vasodilate, and that comes from the fact that you're using oxygen at the muscle level. It's going to signal up the chain and say, hey, we need more oxygen over here, so open up the pipes, bring more blood through. So that's what we call metabolic vasodilation. And to counteract that, or to balance that out, your nervous system is going to vasoconstrict, because if you vasodilate everything at one given time in your body, you don't have enough blood inside your body to maintain flow. So you're just going to pass out, which your brain and your nervous system don't want. So there's also always that interplay between vasodilation from a metabolic standpoint and vasoconstriction from a nervous standpoint to keep blood pressure to its normal level, essentially. And that's another thing that I see as maybe potentially hampering adaptations if you've gone beyond the stages of kind of beginner adaptation to just doing a little bit of low intensity work. If you're switching modality all the time, you're also switching the way your body has to direct blood flow frequently, and that might be counterproductive towards these goals. But that is somewhat on a theoretical level. There's no data to back that up. And there's also the durability aspect, I think, of the sport that is very, very interesting. And I haven't, there probably is, but I haven't heard many people talk about it the way that durability is thought about in cycling, for example, where pro cyclists, and so the very, very best cyclists in the world and very, very good amateur cyclists, they pretty much have very similar power outputs for, say, a 5-minute effort or a 20-minute effort. So the guys that are very good are pretty much the same as the pros when it comes to power output when you're rested. But then when you look at who can output the most power over 5 minutes after 5 hours of riding, the best of the best clearly make the difference. So it's not about who's best when you're fresh, it's who's best when you're fatigued. And it turns out that a big factor in that is how durable are you? How resistant to fatigue are you? And that's directly linked to how much low intensity you're doing, because that low intensity is going to help you develop those type 1 fibers and develop their fatigue resistance. That's why cyclists routinely go out on 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-hour rides on the weekend, once obviously they've built up the volume and the capacity to do those. And fueling is very important there as well. And I think that is another aspect where longer constant efforts on a given modality are interesting, because you can't short circuit that. As soon as you're going to push the intensity, you're going to start recruiting different fibers and fatiguing different fibers, and you're just not going to have the same effect on those type 1 fibers, if you want to keep that simple, because those are the guys that are going to support all the high intensity work. Those are the guys that are going to recycle the lactate that you produce with your type 2 fibers and all that kind of stuff at high intensity. And the more you can develop those and the more fatigue resistant they can be, the more it's going to support your higher outputs, especially when you're fatigued. And for that, you need longer efforts on a given modality. So that's kind of the picture as I see it.
Okay. So for someone that's just starting off with zone 2 work, or is perhaps unfamiliar with doing steady state work, changing between different movements, machines, for a period of time is fine to kind of introduce them into this style, like what may be a new style or a new way of training. But for those of us who are trying to maximize the benefits from zone 2 work, the increased capillary density, the durability, the fatigue resistance, then staying on one movement or one machine for a prolonged period of time is the goal, and something that we should gradually work towards if we want to maximize the benefits of that, of zone 2 training, steady state training.
That'd be my current take on it. Whether it's actually the case or not still demands to be proven, but that's my direction with things as I move along. And back to your first point, for beginners and for people that are not well versed in those types of training intensities and modalities, it might actually be necessary. I've seen people that can't do more than half an hour on a Concept 2 bike, even going very easy, because they just don't have the capacity to do 40 minutes or 50 minutes. So maybe in the beginning, it might even be required for them to switch every 10 minutes because they just can't tolerate that duration. And that's another thing with duration. I think it's a very interesting stimulus that can be applied, but you can definitely overdo it. Just like you can overdo the weights, you can overdo the duration, especially if you're not accustomed to it. And just because you can do more doesn't mean you should do more. meaning that if you can get adaptations from, and that's a colleague of mine that I like, his name is Kier when I'm flat, for those who follow the rugby scene, or have followed in the past. And he always says, if you apply advanced training methods with an athlete, you rob them twice, because you rob them from the initial linear improvements that they can make using basic approaches, and you rob them from the advanced adaptations they could have gotten when they actually needed them. And I think duration is the same. I think as long as you can get positive adaptation from 2 hours a week, you should stick with 2 hours a week. And once you need 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then you can go there. But just because the Norwegians are doing 40-hour-a-week training now doesn't mean you should do that. They took 20 years to build up to that. Sam Lelo's one of the top French triathletes at this point in time. He's 24 and he's only training 23, 24 hours a week. So he still has 10 hours that he can use, but he's not using them now. He has the time. He could train more, but he doesn't need it. He can still get better on 24. So why do 34? You keep 34 for 4 or 5 years down the road when you actually need them. So yeah, I think duration is a very interesting parameter to play with, but you shouldn't use it too early. And the other thing, it's just like strength, where it's going to take you 10 years to get to a significant level and strength. It's the same with that. You can't rush the process, and so you better start early.
Yeah, but then now, if you haven't already,
as in now, yeah. If you're not lucky, like you were to, have those concepts applied, a decade ago already, and with the rowing and whatnot, people that have never done that, I definitely think are at a disadvantage. Maybe not on their performance level, so to speak, but I do see that endurance playing a big role in work capacity and in recovery capacity. And the more you can recover from, the better you can train, and the higher the quality of the training is going to be. So that, I think, going back to our chat before about, it's not about how long your test is, it's about how much you have to train to get better at your sport. And that's where I see that low intensity stuff being so interesting, is that if you can train more or just recover better from the training you're currently doing, it has its place.
You mentioned there about well, two things. First of all, the point about just because the top athletes are doing a certain amount of hours doesn't necessarily mean that that's the number of hours that you need to be doing that's going to be best for you, which I think is a really important point that can also be extrapolated to athletes in all sports in terms of what training they are all doing. It's an important thing to understand that the training that the athletes that are at the top of any given sport are doing right now may not, and probably is not, the training that got them there. And like understanding that the difference in the process is probably going to serve you better than just trying to mimic what the top athletes are doing right now.
Agreed.
In terms of duration, and you said about like if you can, for instance, adapt, like get positive adaptations and benefits, performance increases from doing 2 hours a week, that is not necessary to bump it up to 4 hours a week. Is there a kind of like an easy way for people to see that this is an appropriate amount of the zone 2 or steady state work for me to be doing right now? Is it a case of looking at how it's affecting other aspects of their training, or do you say that if you're training a certain amount of hours, that this percentage of that time should be zone 2 work? What are some easy ways that an athlete could perhaps look at it to know that they're doing the right amount right now?
I don't know if I have enough experience so far to have very clear benchmarks for different values. In the grand scheme of things, I would say that if you're training competitively for CrossFit, and say you're training 5 days a week or more by doing double sessions, and so if you're not getting at least 2 hours of low intensity, even if it's pre and post training, whether it's in one block or not, just getting some portion of the volume in that way is very important. And then how to know if you're doing enough. I think you're going to feel it first and foremost. I think especially if you've never done it, or if you've just done it but you were going too hard, the moment you switch to doing it where it's really easy and when it doesn't cost you anything from an effort standpoint, some of the reference points I like to give is you should be able to hold a conversation, and you should feel better at the end of your session than you did at the beginning. So you shouldn't feel any weight in the legs. You shouldn't feel any tingling during your session. If you're doing something steady, like on the biker, I like to look at heart rate drift. So if you're doing a steady effort, I don't know, you're doing 130 watts on the bike and you're keeping that constant for an hour. If you look at your heart rate in minute 10, and then you look at your heart rate minute 60, if there's more than 5 beats difference, you're probably going too fast, or you can't tolerate that duration yet. That's back to the thing I was saying before. So I like to see a nice steady heart rate from the beginning of the session all the way through to the end with a RPE of about 3. That's usually as high as I'll go. And yes, we can talk about the 4 and 5 RPE, and for some it might be appropriate, but it's also that kind of middle ground between easy and not hard, but not so easy either, that too many people get drawn into, oh, well, if 3 is good, I can probably do 5 and get away with it. But then you creep into the 5, and then you might not be in the same state that we want you in for that work. And now that work starts to cost you from a nervous standpoint, from a metabolic standpoint. So hence the pretty conservative recommendation of 3 out of 10. But it serves its purpose. Back to what you were saying before. Yeah, I said 2 hours, but for someone like you competing and training a lot, and you have trained for many years, and you have that background already, obviously you can do significantly more than that. And as long as you fuel appropriately, I don't see it having a negative impact in any way on your training at large. It's quite to the contrary. Again, people think, oh yeah, but I'm going to be training more, so now I need to eat more, and it's going to probably make me more fatigued from all the other stuff. Even for people that are probably training too much for their current work capacity, it usually has the positive aspect of balancing out the nervous system a little bit. What I mean by that is whenever we're doing intense stuff, we're going to go into the sympathetic side of our autonomic nervous system. And one of the features of low intensity training is that it's a parasympathetic dominant. And that's one of the reasons why long distance endurance athletes have very low heart rates. Yes, they have a huge heart, and that's why they don't have to pump as much to push the blood, but it's also because they have very high parasympathetic tone from a nervous system standpoint. And that is also a factor that's going to drop heart rates at rest, for example. So that's why you see very low heart rates. And that's an easy way to drop your resting heart rates, is by doing a period of low intensity training, because your nervous system is going to be more on the parasympathetic side of things, and it's going to reduce that or dampen that sympathetic tone a little bit and allow you to recover. So that, again, back to what I was saying, I've seen that have a positive impact on people. Even if you add a couple hours of low intensity on an maybe already overloaded schedule, it seems to actually make that schedule more tolerable. And now whether that's the right approach, or should they just do a little bit less, I'll probably both. I don't know if I answered your question regarding the volume.
Definitely, yeah, and some as well there, like that, just that last little bit there about it could also be potentially a tactic to use on yourself, or if you're working with another athlete, if you or your athlete is someone who's like really like been captured by the sport of CrossFit, and you're all in and they love training, they want to do all of this training, it could be a way of allowing, kind of like satiating that appetite for more training without causing more fatigue, and potentially also developing a greater capacity so that they can actually tolerate that amount of training in the future as well. So like a twofold benefit. You actually also touched on my next question there, which was about changes in heart rate across the session. It's something that I've heard you talk about in your podcast before, about if you're choosing the appropriate intensity for your zone 2 work. And that would be with the assumption that you haven't been able to do the physiological testing to know exactly what intensity that you should be holding on each element as well. The heart rate drift, what is an acceptable heart rate change across a session? And you said there like roughly around 5 beats. Could you perhaps explain a little bit like what it is that causes that heart rate drift across the session, and why it's important that there isn't a bigger change in that across the session?
Yeah, my understanding of that is that if you start to recruit higher threshold motor units, and as such, the muscle fibers that are associated with them, which are usually going to be type 2A. If we go from type 1 to type 2A to type 2X to simplify the spectrum of I guess the recruiting principle of the Henneman size principle of how motor units are recruiting along the intensity spectrum, depending on the force that needs to be applied. Once you go into those, say, fatigable fibers, so you get out of your type 1 pool, and again, it's a model. It's simpler to understand like that. It doesn't actually exactly happen like that inside the body, but it's simple to understand that at low intensity, you're going to recruit your type 1 fibers. If you go up a little bit, you get type 2A. And if you get to very explosive stuff, you're type 2X. Type 2A fibers are going to be more fatigable than your type 1 fibers. And when a fiber fatigues, what your body has to do is now go and recruit another motor unit and other muscle fibers to kind of fill the void that this fatigued fiber left, to speak simply. And as you keep going along and keep recruiting up the chain, because you're fatiguing, now you're going to have that fatigue aspect and building into more demand for blood flow and a higher, or the heart rate increasing across the session. And obviously, if you're in a hot environment, back to what we were saying before, the heart rate drift is almost inevitable, because you're just going to have to keep shifting more blood to your skin to cool your body down. So that's a different situation. So if you're well fed, well hydrated, and you're not in a hot environment, you should try to find a nice flat heart rate when you're doing those low intensity sessions.
And so, as opposed to starting at an intensity that, if we take heart rate, for instance, as being like the measure that you're using, and you've correlated that to being in the right zone for your zone 2 work, as opposed to starting it at an intensity that gets the heart rate to where you want it to be, and then as fatigue kicks in, gradually dropping, say, the wattage to stay at that heart rate, you should actually start at the intended intensity and just maintain that all the way through the session.
Yeah, I think you could maybe justify both, but I think that it's probably more prudent to try to maintain the same intensity throughout the session without seeing a heart rate drift.
Yeah.
Because if you're having to drop your intensity to maintain a given heart rate, it just means you started too high, because you couldn't maintain.
To tap into those fatigable fibers, and so therefore you're not getting the sought after adaptations, because you're no longer training the.
Yeah, and I think we also have to again think of the cost of those sessions, right? That they have on the system. It's you were talking about the 1 cup analogy in the podcast before, where we have 1 cup, which is all the stress that we can tolerate, or all our marbles that we can play with in a given day or in a given week. And if you do it right, as in if you do it low enough and easy enough, that low intensity stuff, okay, bearing you don't go on a 7-hour ride when you're just not accustomed to doing that. But if you're, piecing together a few hours here and there, doing 30-minute post sessions, post intensities, active recoveries, like you were talking about, those sessions are virtually free. No marbles will be required to fuel those sessions. Obviously, fuel, you feed yourself. But other than that, they don't cost you anything from a nervous standpoint. They don't cost you anything from a metabolic standpoint, except for the fuel itself. And by being at the right intensity, you're going to, again, make sure that it doesn't cost you anything. And if you do go a little bit too high and maybe start too high, and then probably going to be staying a little bit too high, even if you drop that power and keep that heart rate there, it just means it's going to cost you something. How much? It's hard to say. But if you're constantly just dropping a marble here and there, at some point they might add up and have a negative effect on your overall stress bucket, versus just keeping it low enough so that it doesn't cost you anything.
And arguably over time, actually, in that analogy, adding marbles, so that essentially both within the week, because you're more recovered from the training that you've done, but also over time, giving you essentially, when your training capacity increases, giving you more marbles to play with in the future as well.
I am going to be stealing that one from you right then and there, because
I really,
I've used the marble analogy forever, and yeah, it's you're literally adding marbles to your pool so they can play more.
yeah,
That's really what it is. And I think we have to look at out of the sports, and CrossFit has been great in doing that over the years. We have to look at, how elite cyclists train. They do 20-25 hours a week of really easy stuff so that they can throw down 2-3 times a week and really, really go for it.
mm,
Um, and if these guys are only doing 3 really hard efforts a week, how many could we or should we be doing if we're training 6, 8, 10, 12 hours?
mm,
So I think
mm,
we can definitely learn stuff from those other sports. And obviously, it's not the exact same thing. And I definitely don't count strength in there. I think that I'm really talking about the high cost metabolic tests, if we want to call it that, that are formatted as CrossFit workouts. But obviously, you can do more than 2 hard metabolic sessions per week, plus strength and weightlifting is totally fine, and people can usually tolerate that if you structure your program appropriately. But unfortunately, when I see people doing 2 or 3 days of max strength plus 3 or 4 metcons, that is usually, that's too many marbles. And so what happens then, it's simply that, again, you only have a certain amount of marbles to play with. So if you're, let's say you have 50 marbles total, but you're trying to spend 10 marbles a day every day of the week. That's 70. That's too many marbles. You can't spend that much. So your body is just going to say, okay, you want to try and spend everything you can. I'm only going to let you spend 8. So you're trying to give 10, but you're only actually spending 8. Your nervous system is going to restrict you and not let you actually exploit your full potential, because
mm.
you're just trying to spend those marbles too often and saying, no, 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 we can't do that. Otherwise, we're going to blow up. So we auto regulate. And that's usually what happens when somebody's training too much, and you either cut down their training volume or you add some low intensity and rebalance things. When they try to go hard again a couple months later, they're like, whoa, I went harder than I ever went before. It's like, yeah, because before you were just trying to push too much too often.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely, and I know you said zone 2 is my thing, and I talk about it a lot. And I believe high intensity is absolutely fundamental to performance, right? I'm not the guy to say you have to do everything slow all the time. You absolutely have to throw down. You absolutely have to go hard. You just have to consider the opportunity costs of those efforts and then balance them well in the overall framework of training.
And it rarely takes much persuasion for people to go hard in a
Yeah.
CrossFit workout versus spend 60 to 90 minutes on a bike at low
What I
intensity.
yeah, the one I like to use is, oh yeah, I've got Thursday is my recovery day, but can I do a bit of zone 2 on my recovery day? Okay, so I went for a zone 2 run, and then there was a hill, and then I felt like I wanted to push, so then I pushed up the hill, and then
Yeah,
that's my recovery day.
yeah, yeah.
Just to push it to the extreme. But yeah, I think, like you said, it's a lot more enjoyable, and again, there's a lot of high value in the high intensity work. 100%. You look at beginners, you look at the buy-in, you look at the hormonal side of things, what happens when you go hard and what it
Yeah.
brings you. All those things are great, but we just have to, once we build the engine and once we are strong and we're fit, we just have to be intelligent in how we express that.
It's interesting what you said there about the effects of people going too hard in the zone 2 sessions, or perhaps not having enough lower intensity work to balance out the higher intensity work that they've got in the week.
Mm.
Something that Emma and I have spoken about a lot in the past is this concept of what we call mellanmjölk training, and which basically means like semi-skimmed milk training. So in Sweden you have mjölk, which is milk, which is like the full fat, and you have lättmjölk, which is like skimmed, it's the very low fat
Yeah.
milk, and then you have mellanmjölk, which is in the middle.
Yeah.
And what often happens when you first get into the sport, or what a lot of people, a pitfall that people often experience, that we've found, we've been through as well, is you have your mjölk, your high intensity hard sessions, and then you have your lättmjölk, which is your low intensity easier sessions. You start doing your lättmjölk sessions too hard, and then eventually because you're so fatigued from doing that low intensity work at a higher intensity than was prescribed or that you should have done, the higher intensity work ends up needing to drop because you just don't have the capacity left to push that hard after your system's been drained by the lower intensity stuff as well. And so essentially, instead of having like an appropriately polarized week of sessions, you end up with everything just becoming melamiel training. The easy training is too hard and the hard training isn't hard enough, and it's just a bit kind of in the middle. And when you can fix that and balance it out and recover properly, you really do feel the effects of going really hard, get the stimulus, go really easy, get the stimulus, and all the boxes are ticked.
I'd never heard the milk analogy. The one I have is from Charlie Francis, which was medium works in clothing, not in training. So keep your highs high and your lows low.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that, and that's a framework that I used when I was working in rugby. I think the high low intensity model throughout the week. So having some days where you know you're going to be pushing, and so you condense intensity and load on those days. And then you have low intensity days or just development days where you can do some quality work. It doesn't mean you just have to sit on the bike and do nothing else. There's lots of skills, lots of things we can develop. But condensing those days instead of trying to spread them out, right? And instinctively, we want to spread them out because we say, oh, so I want to do if I had 4 hard sessions to do, well, I want to do one on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Saturday so that they're spread out and I can do my best. I'd rather have you do 2 on the Tuesday and then 2 on the Saturday. And that way, the rest of the days you can build, develop, recover, and be ready for those really, really hard days. So first thing I did when I started working with Claudia was align my intensities with Mjolnir's program's intensities so that we're condensing them and we're just not adding, intensity left and right, because at the end of the week, otherwise it's not going to work.
Yeah. I really like that concept of kind of picking your days and picking your battles. It's mentally it makes the week a lot easier to manage as well, knowing that this is the day when I'm going really hard, and then you have a time to like mentally deload. And as you say, like there's plenty of things that you can focus on, especially in CrossFit where there's so many skills to master. There's so many ways to get better that don't require you to be at a high intensity as well.
And I also want to say that when I said, it's either high or low, it doesn't mean that the highs always have to be at a 9 or 10 out of 10. I think that especially within CrossFit, from what I've seen, there's a huge development opportunity in that kind of mid-range of intensities, that say 30 to 60-minute range, that is completely underdeveloped, if not completely ignored, because 1, it's long, 2, it's boring, 3, it hurts, but it doesn't hurt that much. So we're thinking 6 or 7 out of 10. Who's ever finished a session and said, oh yeah, it was a 6 out of 10? It's either your 3 or either your 10. There's not, and I was the first to do that. And so I know where that comes from. But I do think that some of the intensities at some points of the year, obviously it's not all year the same for everybody, but there's periods where maybe your highs are 7, 8 out of 10, because this is the type of session and the type of development you're after. And other times you're 9 and 10. And obviously the closer to competition you are, the 9 and 10 are going to become more important. But just because you're doing a high intensity effort, I don't think it has to be an all out effort. All out should be kept for special moments in competition. And if you're always leaving it all out on the floor, instead of keeping a little bit under the pedal, then maybe there's something to be said to optimize that a little bit further.
A question a little bit more about, I suppose, like a minutiae aspect of the zone 2 session. You said in the past that your 2 favorite methods for zone 2 training that are cycling and running. But you've also said you've spoken about the distinction between that it's a C2 bike, or so essentially like a road bike style bike, versus an echo or an assault bike. Off the back of that, why do you prefer the C2 or the road bike? And I'm guessing that some of that is going to be to do with the RPM, the cadence of the movement. And is there therefore like an optimal RPM or cadence that we should be looking at for those zone 2 sessions on a bike?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I am partial to the bike and the run with the prerequisite of being able to tolerate a decent amount of running, right? Don't go run an hour, because if you've never run for the last 6 months, because it's going to go great today, but in 3 weeks, your shins are going to be, screaming at you. So we have to consider, progressive overload and those kind of boring things when we start running, especially for heavier CrossFit athletes that are usually muscular. And so the cost of running is usually a little bit higher. And the other side of things is bike versus fan bike, let's call them, or whole body bike, whether it's an eco bike or assaults. You did mention the cadence on the Concept 2 bike. I like anything between 75 and 95, I think, is kind of the regular range, or 80 to 85 to if we want to be a little, closer or smaller on the bracket. I think it's important to be comfortable with anything between 60 and 130. So some aspects of this, power or force velocity continuum have to be explored throughout the season so that you're at least proficient in whether you're at low cadence or at high cadence, because at some point they're going to say damper 10 and you have to do that much with damper 10, and you just have to be able to do it at 50 RPMs, same thing, you have to know how to sprint, and that's a skill in and of itself from a coordination standpoint. So I think sprinting on a bike is really beneficial as well, and being able to reach 120 130 RPMs on a bike, on a road bike or bike erg or any version of what bike, I don't really care, is going to be beneficial on that side of things. The assault bikes and the eco bikes, the downside is the coupling of the output with the cadence. So essentially, if you're going slowly, you're also spinning very, very slowly, which I'm not very fond of. You think about at a given power output, if you're spinning faster, it means you're producing less force per contraction or per pedal stroke than if you're going at a lower RPMs, right? So to take an extreme example, if I'm spinning at 50 RPMs or 100 RPMs, well, at 50 RPMs on each pedal stroke, I'll be producing twice as much force as I would at 100 RPMs. And I think one of the interests of higher cadence is, one, for the coordination, but two, for the blood flow aspect as well. Because one of the things I was talking about, the metabolic vasodilation, sympathetic vasoconstriction before, there's a third parameter. It's mechanical compressions from muscular contractions themselves. And if we have big, strong muscular contractions, it's going to occlude blood flow, even temporarily. And I think this has a potential downside on the general adaptation of, hey, constant blood flow, really easy rate of work. So I'm not fond of it for that. I'm not fond of it either for smaller athletes, most females, and then some of the guys, because of the muscle mass involved, the cardiac load is going to be significant. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I think it's a tool that you can use at the right point in time. But that isn't necessarily the limiting factor in many people. Most of CrossFitters that I see and test and work with, their legs are limiting them more than their hearts, meaning that on a given effort, they're on a bike, for example, their heart still has room to go up in beats per minute, but they have to stop because of their legs, meaning that if we train them appropriately, their legs, which is currently the limiting factor, if we take kind of the limiter bridge model from Evan and those guys, if you free up the legs, now your heart can pump higher, right? And I've seen that time and time again. People coming in for testing, they get up to, I don't know, 165, 168 BPMs on the last stage of the test, and then they have to stop, and it's obviously their legs limiting them, and they tell me, I had to stop because of my legs, my heart is fine, my breathing's okay. And then you train them for a few months, and then they come back, and then they do an extra stage or two, and their heart rate goes up to 177. So it's not that, oh, we've trained their heart to beat faster. No, it's just that before, the legs were so limiting that they couldn't actually leverage their heart and what the heart is capable of. And so in that context, for most CrossFitters, the heart's not going to be the issue. It's going to be the legs and the development in the legs themselves. And so using an air bike might be very interesting at certain points of the year for specific reasons. But from what I've seen so far, one, the bike is rarely used. So it's an interesting modality because it's never used, and because the best stimulus is the one you never had. So you can get better adaptations from the bike because you never actually do it. And two, the transfer from the bike to the eco bike is insane. it's really surprising to me how, and it's not necessarily news to anybody that, oh, the legs play a big part in the assault bike and those modalities. Nothing new there, but with Claudia, we haven't touched an eco bike in training since July last year, since I started working with her one-on-one, and she's been doing really well on the eco bike tests that she's had, whether it's in training or in competition. We do not train that aspect. She spends a ton of time on the bike though. And I do see us using that as a training tool for a specific block at some point in time, but again, don't change if it ain't broken. As long as she keeps improving on the bike, we're just going to use that because it's easy. It doesn't cost much. It's more comfortable too to do an hour on the bike than on the eco bike. So yeah, I'm partial to the bike, but I don't think the assault bike is a bad tool at all. I think, for bigger guys like you, great tool to develop that. Because you guys have a lot of muscle mass, you're big, you're not going to be hampered as much. A guy like you with big capacity is probably going to be able to ride at higher wattages than the average person, so that makes the cadence a little bit higher. I have a friend who rows in the master division in the 500 meter on the rower, and he does all his conditioning on the assault bike. So obviously all his rows are specific and the really hard, disgusting sessions. But otherwise he does almost everything on the assault bike because he doesn't want to spend an hour pulling 200 watts on a rower when he only needs to pull for a minute and 15 seconds at whatever insane wattage it is. So yeah, I like the bike better for all those reasons, but I still think there's a place obviously for the fan bikes. You find them often enough in tests and competitions that it doesn't seem like it needs to be trained as much as people might think.
Okay, thank you very much. Just on the note there of what you said about, it's funny that you brought up running, because I was going to say, when you said about the transfer of the bike, the C2 bike to the Echo or assault bike or the fan bike in general, another big element in our training when I was rowing was cycling, and that was like, apart from rowing itself, that was the next go-to movement for conditioning, and the carryover from that to rowing was also big. So again, another reason to get your time on the bike. Two more quick questions for you, which I think you'll rattle through. They're fairly more simple ones than what we've been through already. The value of long sessions versus multiple shorter sessions throughout the week. And you touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the durability and fatigue resistance aspect. Is there anything that is added to that or different to that with this? So that's, for instance, doing 20 to 30 minutes at the end of your regular session training versus doing an hour to 90 minutes as a separate session in the week.
Yeah, I think the durability aspect is the important part. And I think for people that have done it enough, you'll notice that 15 to 20 minutes is usually just time to warm up. And obviously, if you're doing it as a cool down, you're already warm. That's not the issue there. But it takes some time to find that internal place where you're nice and stable, nice and easy. And usually it's about at least 10 to 15 minutes, if not a little bit more, depending on how you're built and what you're predisposed to. So again, as for beginners or people not beginners in the sport necessarily, but people that are beginning with this type of training, it's totally fine to do 20 minutes here and there and just accumulate a couple hours over the week, whether it's pre-warm up, post session, both. It doesn't really matter. Just get the minutes in. As you get to higher levels, I think getting solid blocks of training, and we're starting to explore with Claudia longer sessions once a week at the appropriate time in the year, obviously. But I think those longer sessions, and obviously with the nice days coming back, getting her on a bike outside and in the sun and spending a couple hours spinning and having a good time is going to be important as well. I think those longer sessions, if they can be done, should be done maybe once a week. And again, you should start with already try to do an hour consistently 2 or 3 times a week before you start trying to get hour and 15, hour and a half, or anything more than that.
Cool. My final question was zone 2 in a pre-fatigue state versus a fresh state. So something that we've played around with is running and the durability aspect of running, but also the kind of like the fatigue aspect of running, because I'm like a heavier athlete. Emma spent a lot of time in a pool when she was younger, and so hasn't had a lot of
Mm.
time for those like tissues that we would have built up through like spending a lot of time on her feet. She hasn't had, and so we've put a lot of our kind of like lower intensity, longer running sessions the day before a recovery day, and
Mm.
that usually means that they're on the like the end of the day after the rest of training.
Mm.
And what kind of effect does that have on the adaptation that you're making to that session when you've just say finished some tougher metcons and some tougher workouts, and then you go into the zone 2 work versus if you're going into it fresh?
I think in that specific case, I'd be more concerned about the load on the joints and on the nervous system at that point of the time in the day after all that work than I would be about whether it's good or not for the adaptations of the low intensity. Because running, there's the motor skill aspect of running, and I mean, you know how you feel when you're running and you're not fresh. And so there's definitely something to be said for learning to run under fatigue. But then there's probably also when do you do it during the season and to what ends? And for someone who's not accustomed to running, maybe running more and getting accustomed to running fresh and having good sensations with it is probably very important in the beginning. And then as the season goes on, or as you get more accustomed with it, pushing it back in the training day or behind other work to the point where you're fatigued going into it, would be a good way to maybe overload the running. One way to progress it further. But for people that are heavy and or not accustomed to running, I'd probably try to run rested in the beginning at least.
Okay, okay. So then you're not so much on the adaptation side, like physiologically, but more like the skill development side, that you are not like ingraining bad habits from the start by basically like running with poor technique because you're already fatigued.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. So if I had to choose, I'd probably say, well, can you do the run early in the day on another day and maybe do an hour of on the bike after a hard session, you know?
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
think that we do that quite often with Claudia, where she'll do a hard set on the rower and then she'll ride for a while as a way to make the session longer, but I don't want her to spend an hour and a half on the rower, right?
Mm.
Because it's taxing, because the position, because technique is more important than anything else on those machines. So we want to maintain that as a top priority. So we try to do that fresh, and then we try to extend with the bike on the back end. You can definitely use the run for that. I would just be cautious about the overload that it might impose on the system.
Okay, but on a in terms of an adaptation, from an adaptation perspective, if you're going into those sessions fatigued, but not fatigued enough that it's degrading the skill of running,
Yeah,
but just carrying more fatigue, maybe locally in the legs, or just
yeah.
having still recovering from a workout that you're doing, so that your heart rate is potentially elevated to higher than it would be at a
Mhm.
certain pace if you were fresh. Is there anything else that you would need to consider there with the
Yeah.
session?
Great follow up. When I was talking about the cyclists before, and pro cyclists versus very good cyclists, and how the decrement in performance in the very elite pro cyclists is less than with others, so they're able to again output a given power, or they're able to output a high percentage of their max power on any given time domain even when they're fatigued. One of the reasons is that as you fatigue, if you think about the thresholds where they are on the intensity spectrum, they're going to fall back to the left. They're going to go down. So if you were to test your 60-minute max average watts on a bike now, and if you were to do it after a full day of training, it wouldn't be the same. And that's because those values will have dropped. And so you have to consider that as well when you add anything cyclical or monostructural after or in a fatigued state, is that you won't be able to maintain the same paces as you would have fresh. So you should probably slow down. You should probably go even slower than you would have otherwise, because you're just not essentially you're not as fit as you were at the beginning of the day, and you have to account for that. Otherwise, again, you're not doing low intensity. Now you're a little bit too high again.
Right. That's everything from me. Thank you very much. I want to really appreciate your time, and you've I'm going to have to listen to this episode back again with my notebook and just digest everything, take notes, and just see how we can apply that to our training, because there's a lot of little, I'm not even going to say little, big nuggets there that I know that we can use to optimize our training and recovery as well.
Awesome, man. Well, it was a lot of fun. One, having you on the show before, and then two, during that Q&A session, and a good exercise to for me to try and, you know, coherently say what I have in my head. So it's always easier when you think about it than when you have to communicate it. But yeah, I think you were able to get a few things out of that. And if you have any follow-ups, we can always do another one of those down the line.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I mean, I feel like it's like one of those like shows where like an average Joe gets to go and like interview their favorite celebrity or something, because it's like I've listened to so many of your podcast episodes, and like it's very rare that you actually get to go on a podcast with the person you're listening to and ask them all the questions that you've picked up. So I feel like this is a luxury. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
No, I was laughing because you said celebrity, and that's a term that my wife likes to use with me when to bug me, because I don't consider myself. I just don't like the word. I'd like to be recognized for my work. That's what I'd like to be. But yeah. Anyway, I think it's important. I think it's important that we share those informations, and obviously you're open to it because you're here and you were there for the podcast before. And hopefully the better information we can disseminate, the better people will be able to train, the faster they'll be able to reach their goals, the better health they'll be able to stay in. At the end of the day, the more people we can help, the better. So here we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring everyone together. Like, it's just elevating the kind of like communal knowledge of the whole fitness industry, so everyone just gets closer to a truth that's going to make us better.
That's my hope.
Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thanks, man.